All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our sixth lecture of Chem 390, where today we're going to focus on sort of the health effects related to wildfires. So many of you are probably planning to or already do work in some area related to firefighting. So it is probably, I'm making an assumption here, hopefully it's a safe one. It's probably safe to assume that you care about occupational safety of firefighting. Um, and so part of today, what we'll talk about is where and in what capacity should you be exposed to like wildfire firefighting gear. How does that impact your exposure to things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons? And then we'll also just talk in a more general sense about wildfire toxicity with living organisms, including aquatic life and people. So let's jump right in. So let's start with wildfire toxicity related to water. And specifically, what we're going to focus on here is Daphnia magna, which is a water flea. And this is a very common, what we call in biology, a model organism. So another example of a model organism is something like Drosophila, which is just a fruit fly. So it may seem very insignificant that we're focusing on, this little 2 millimeter sized organism, but the whole purpose of model organisms in biology and biochemistry is to act as a proxy for other living organisms should they be exposed to, in this case, things related to wildfires. Okay? So if we think back to our water and soil lecture, we'll remember that some things were significantly more present in the soil after a wildfire that ultimately get washed into natural waterways. So these include organic carbon, elemental carbon, and then we also talked about how some things like nitrates in the soil can increase. We talked about specifically organonitrate species in our water and soil lecture, but just to keep our discussion here a little bit more simple, we're just going to pretend that all of those exist as nitrate, which is a mostly accurate assumption for summarizing their chemical reactivity. It's simple enough that we can just say they're nitrates, okay? NO3 minus, this molecule here. So an interesting what's interesting about this research article here that I'm referencing in this lecture is that a lot of these things that we saw appear in water and soil can actually lead to toxic effects in water fleas and aquatic organisms in general, okay? So in this one research article, or this study, what was observed was that in or Daphnia, there should be an N in there. It's Daphnia. Daphnia magna, I'm just going to abbreviate as D magna here. Not magma, magna, like the Magna Carta. So in D magna, what was observed after just being present in waters that were affected or that were in a region affected by a wildfire, what was observed was higher amounts of elemental carbon, EC, and of specific concern. So we're going to be talking about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons a lot today. So in most cases, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are the main bad thing that is present in elemental carbon. In these water fleas, there were higher amounts of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which we'll talk about in detail for why these are bad for just living organisms in general. Higher amounts of nitrates, which we'll talk about why those are bad, chlorides, and there's a couple others. The last one I want to list here is what's called pH. So pH we didn't really specifically define ever in our previous lectures. Basically, it's a measure of how much hydrogen cations are present, so H plus. So if we were to think of pH, something that is relatively acidic, if you were to ingest it, would taste relatively sour, okay? We're not really talking about pH in this context in terms of flavor, but that's just to give you an idea of sort of its chemical reactivity. You know, if you eat a bunch of sour candy, it starts to really like almost burn the inside of your mouth. So it's very chemically reactive in higher concentrations, okay? And it was observed that these higher amounts of toxins, I guess we can call them, contaminants in the water, did actually lead to a toxic effect in these water fleas. It's not really clear, so I guess I'll put that here in writing. So these led to I guess we should just say death. That's really what I'm talking about here when I say toxic effect in D. magna. And the reasons why aren't really clear, because what these researchers did is they systematically dosed water fleas essentially with elemental carbon on its own, nitrates on its own, chloride on their own, and also expose them to higher pH. That's one thing that's useful to mention, is that something that is relatively acidic is what we were characterized with that sour flavor or that sour taste, that burning sensation, high amounts of H+. Conversely, you can have something that is basic that if we were to do taste comparisons, it tastes relatively bitter, and this is a low H+ condition. And it's specifically a basic shift of water pH occurs after wildfire ash and soil is washed into it post-wildfire, okay? All of that is to say is that these researchers tested each of these conditions individually, so the same levels of elemental carbon, same levels of nitrate, same levels of chloride, same levels of basic pH. Individually, there was no produced toxic effect, which is interesting, makes it very confusing, but rather what this is sort of detailing is these things are all acting in concert to eventually lead to death in the water flea in this case. And to avoid complicated discussion on how these toxic effects were assessed, just know that when I say there was led to death, so what these researchers did is they tested several different ash samples from different regions, and all of which produced a toxic effect, and in some cases, 100% of D. magna was deceased after 24 hours exposure in some, 48 hours in others, okay? The term they used in the article is immobilized, which just means they stopped moving or they were dead. It's the scientific way of saying it, but a complete wipeout of these aquatic organisms, which obviously is really, really bad and summarizes or depicts some of the negative toxic effects that wildfires can have on aquatic systems. You know, certainly for like fish and other amphibious species that are going to be exposed to this water as well, the doses that will lead to death are going to be much higher. But at least for these water fleas at the bottom of the food chain, that can disrupt some natural ecological processes by working its way up the food chain. You know, if the bottom is wiped out post wildfire, then certainly the upper echelons or the upper tiers, if you will, of the food chain are going to be affected as well. Okay, so I guess all of this is to say that wildfires produce a toxic effect in aquatic organisms. Why is not super well understood, What we can appreciate, though, is how these things lead to a toxic effect on their own. And I'm specifically going to focus on how elemental carbon and nitrates lead to a toxic effect in living organisms. We're going to talk about elemental carbon a little bit later in the lecture with our discussion on polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but for now we can at least talk about nitrates. Why are these bad to have in water? And this also applies for humans. Really, this sort of toxic effect is true for any living species. The reasons why these are toxic is because your body, in the case of humans or the water fleas, really any living organism can metabolize these to produce what is called nitrite. So this one here is nitrate, and this here is nitrite. And nitrites, specifically, these are very oxidizing molecules. In the case of humans, so for humans, we use hemoglobin in our blood to transport oxygen to all of our cells so that they can produce adenosine triphosphates and ultimately carry out their cellular function. So for humans, what this nitrite does is, so NO2 minus converts iron 3. So iron 3 plus is sort of the main element doing the work in hemoglobin that is binding oxygen and transporting it to all of our cells. So I've heard, or I've had some friends who were college athletes in the past, and they told me that their coaches would make them take iron supplements for this very reason of making their blood transport oxygen more effectively. I don't know if that's actually sound advice in that case, but the logic behind that is because iron is related to transporting oxygen through your blood. So what nitrites do is they convert these iron 3s into, or I think I have this backwards. Hang on, give me a second. Okay, I knew something was off because I'm saying here that they're oxidizing, and I was about to write a reduction reaction. That's because I have the wrong oxidation state for iron 2. I'll explain what I mean by that in a sec. But anyway, the iron in hemoglobin is present as iron 2 plus, so it's an iron atom with 2 electrons removed from it, giving therefore an imbalance of protons to electrons, leading to a 2 plus charge on the element, on the atom. So what nitrites do, they're oxidizing, so they will oxidize this. So one way to think of oxidation states we talked about earlier was adding oxygens to an element. So that is one way to think about oxidations. Really what's happening at the core of the theory and the chemistry of what's happening during an oxidation is the number of electrons relative to protons in the atom being oxidized or reduced is changing. So when we say an oxidation in chemistry, what we're really saying is we're removing electrons from something that can manifest as adding oxygens to it, but really what's happening there is oxygen is swooping in and taking the electrons from the atom being oxidized. I digress. None of that you're going to be tested on, by the way. All I'm trying to say here is that nitrites convert iron 2 to iron 3. Iron 3 cannot bind O2, cannot bind to O2, or I should say it cannot bind as effectively. And this results to, in some cases, in the cases of pregnant mothers who are exposed to a significant amount of nitrates in water, this can lead to what is called blue baby syndrome. It's particularly more harmful to infants and young children, where basically what happens in infants and young children who are particularly prone to these negative health effects caused by nitrites is their hemoglobin is unable to transport oxygen to your cells. So you have a very, very low oxygen content in your blood. In that case, blood eventually starts to turn like a purpley bluish color. And in the case of, severe effects of this, and the child or infant, whatever, will appear to be blue. Okay, so that's why it's called blue baby syndrome. So really, really not good stuff. And it's not to say that this stuff is harmless in adults. It can certainly harm adults as well. It's just that this is sort of the common name that the medical community refers to it by. I believe the proper name is methemoglobinemia. Methemoglobinemia. Anemia. Nice, awesome long word that the medical community loves. We'll see a couple more long words later in the lecture. Globinemia. There we go. But yeah, so this is, at least in humans, how nitrates can lead to toxic effects. In things like Daphnia magna, there's no hemoglobin. The oxygen transport mechanisms in aquatic species is very variable, let's say. It differs significantly from species to species, but they don't use iron to. Sometimes these aquatic organisms can use vanadium. So like vanadium actually has 4 stable oxidation states, which is really interesting. So vanadium 2 plus, 3 plus, 4 plus, and 5 plus. So vanadium has a lot of different oxidation states that it can take. But regardless, there is some element responsible for getting oxygen to this living organism's cells. So, because at the very base of this, this is a eukaryotic organism, meaning that it has a requirement of oxygen, let's say. That's one way to think of it. In order to function, in order for its cells to function. So nitrites being oxidizing throw off this chemistry of bringing oxygen to your cells, leading to ultimately death in the extreme case, but really death caused by a lack of oxygen transport throughout the living organism's body. Okay, so this will be true for aquatic species, for humans as well, and yeah. So, like I said, the other big focal point of this lecture is going to be elemental carbon, and then we'll also talk a little bit about particulate matter, organic carbon, and how those lead to a toxic effect. And I'm mostly only focusing on these 3 simply because talking about everything would be way too much information and we wouldn't be able to go as in depth with some of it. So let's just talk about these 3 and you can gain an appreciation for how toxicity arises from a chemical after being exposed to it. So let's first, before we talk about how polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and organic carbons in the form of particulate matter can lead to a toxic effect, let's talk about occupational exposure. So where are you as a firefighter most exposed to, in this case, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in the workplace? If you were to, assist in suppressing a wildfire and you're exposed to a lot of smoke, what is the biggest source of contamination that you're exposed to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons? So this is a really, really interesting study that I've been using for a couple of years now when teaching this course, because I think it does a good job of summarizing some of the occupational exposure to PAHs in firefighting. So what this study did is they were on site with firefighters during a training exercise. So I don't know how common this is in the States. This was in the UK. So this was, across the Atlantic, where at least in the UK, like I said, I don't know how common this is here. It's common for firefighters to do training exercises on contained fires in shipping containers. So this company, Container Alliance, actually is a company that specializes in this, where you can rent a shipping container or just buy one outright. And the material being combusted inside of this shipping container is oriented strand board, or OSB. It's a common board, so it's all this beige looking wood in this construction photo here, where it's a common material used in construction because of it. It's particularly good for load-bearing purposes, so it's good at helping things stay upright during construction, while the structure might not be as structurally sound as it will be by the time it is fully constructed. But anyway, so thing to note here. So what these researchers did is they were on site during this training exercise where firefighters were practicing the suppression of a fire, in this case burning OSB. And what these researchers did is they took samples, they took swabs basically of the wildfire, sorry, I keep saying wildfire, but of the firefighters' equipment before this training exercise and after this training exercise, and just did a chemical analysis on it and wanted to know, how much PAHs were present on the gear of the wildfires and in what relative concentrations. And some of the ones that were being monitored, some of the PAHs being monitored were things like naphthalene. So we've seen this one in the course already, C8H10. Benzoapyrene, which is actually listed as one of the top 15 most harmful carcinogens in water treatment, in water, natural waterways, and it is a big thing that is monitored during the water treatment process. So benzopyrene A, I do not have the formula in my head, so I'm just going to quickly draw it. Pay no mind to my doodles. PAHs are fun to draw because it's just a bunch of hexagons linked together. So this is benzopyrene, or benzoapyrene. So this has, just give me 1 second. Okay, so if you really want to know what I drew over here, you can Google organic structures related to chemistry, and you can teach yourself about skeletal structures. But anyway, benzoapyrene has the chemical formula C20H12, so it's just another form of these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. You can kind of see here these hexagons I drew. One hexagon is what we call a cycle in chemistry, or it can be referred to that way. So polycyclic means a lot of these rings of carbon just stuck together in different ways. And interestingly, it can lead to slightly different toxicity, toxic effects related to the how the rings are stuck together, but that's more of a topic for a higher level chemistry course, so let's not focus on it today. Let's do our last one here. So 7,12-dimethylbenzoanthracene, which looks like this. So this one's kind of funny. It's got two little arms sticking off. And this one has the chemical formula. So let's see. It's the same number of carbons, I think. So C20 and then H16. Okay, so regardless, hopefully you're seeing a pattern here. It's molecules that result from combustion of organic matter, so like wood. And these molecules have a lot of carbons and not so much hydrogen. So usually carbon and hydrogen can bond to form CnHn+2. So if this were to be like a molecule present in oil, there are C20 fragments in petroleum as well. That would have the formula C20, so then H2n+2, there's a 2 there, So it would be like H42. This would be a sort of normal carbon-hydrogen arrangement um, for this type of a molecule, but polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are much more chemically interesting, partly because they have such a small amount of hydrogen relative to the amount of carbon present in the molecules, okay? Um, but in general, you can sort of think of these as molecules that result from combustion, incomplete combustion, I should say, that have a lot of carbon, some amounts of hydrogen, um, and yeah, so these are just three. So here, if we look at what the researchers in this study actually monitored, they monitored, on the order of, what is that, 12? So 12 different um, PAHs. So these aren't just randomly selected. These are PAHs um, listed by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. So listed by the EPA as carcinogenic. So these are things that cause cancer at the appropriate doses. Okay, so that is why these were selected in this research study. So then first, what this data set is the researchers took samples or swabs basically from four different firefighters. That's what FF1 through 4 refers to. So that's firefighter 1, firefighter 2, firefighter 3, firefighter 4. Before the training exercise, so before going into the shipping container with the burning oriented strands board, and after the training exercise. So after they did the exercise, and I assume suppressed the fire or the burning OSB. Okay, and what you can see here, so these are also just skin samples. So this is all on the skin. And the firefighters certainly weren't naked doing this. They were wearing their gear. They were wearing everything they should have been. So, like an SCBA, proper coat, boots, gloves, the whole thing. And still, even with wearing all of that, there was a pretty significant amount of exposure here, okay? So don't worry too much about the y-axis on this graph. We're not going to talk about what lethal or toxic doses of these things are. Basically, just know that you don't want them at all, because we'll learn the way they react is sort of an accumulative effect where they can bind, in some cases, irreversibly to components in your cells that are very important, okay? So just know that it's better to be down here below the detection limit of whatever method they use to detect these PAHs. You do not want to be anywhere above that, ideally, okay? But anyway, so what we can see here is that the two regions that had the highest amounts of PAHs on these firefighters was the front neck. So I'm assuming here is what is meant by that. Or like, just below the jaw, just above the chest, and also the hands, which makes sense, if you're going to be, working with your hands and um, suppressing the fire a lot. It makes sense that would be a region that gets the most exposure. Like you're gonna be touching things that might have been partially burned or extinguished to clear the area, stuff like that. Um, so hands and the neck are the regions where highest exposure was recorded. And you might be wondering, isn't it worse to breathe these in? Isn't that how it gets introduced into your body? Well, there can also be what's called dermal absorption of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So dermal absorption is, relatively speaking, I'm not going to give exact numbers here just because we don't need to think about specific rates of absorption, but just relatively speaking, the front of the neck, so front neck is faster in terms of dermal absorption of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons than the hands. So the hands are relatively slow. But rather, what I think this is a cautionary tale for is the importance of thoroughly washing front of the neck and your hands after being exposed to wildfire smoke and those sorts of particulates, just because those are the regions that are most affected, at least in this specific example of putting out a wildfire in a contained shipping container. So, take these results with a grain of salt. Are they exactly representative of being or like working to suppress an active wildfire? Probably not. Active wildfires don't take place in a shipping container. But regardless, this is useful information, hopefully, for you. At least feedback I've gotten in the past. My students in this course seem to have very much valued this information, which is why I'm continuing on to discuss it here, okay? And one thing that was also done in this study was analyzing the effect of washing. So like washing the clothes, which we'll get to. We haven't talked about clothes yet. And what was observed was that the amounts of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons after disinfecting with like a detergent or like soap, let's say, significantly decreased the amount of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons on the surface that was swabbed. So yeah, it's not like these are stuck here forever on your front of the neck and your hands. You wash with soap, that will get rid of a significant portion of them. Okay, so now let's turn to the clothing and like the gear that was used. So here are, just like before, swabs of various gear that these firefighters were wearing before and after this training exercise. And the specific gear that was tested was the self-contained breathing apparatus, which I got a picture for down here, the zip flap, I'm assuming of the coat that is worn, the shoulder, the gloves, and the hood, that goes under the helmet, okay? And you might be wondering, what the heck happened to this firefighter? Did they just like dive head first into this thing? So this was the instructor. Firefighter 1 was the instructor, which is why this the measurement of PAHs on this particular person was so high, because as the instructor, you're probably doing a lot more hands-on work and being a lot more involved with the process than someone who is learning still, which is why the levels were so high. And it's interesting to note also that even before the exercise, there was still a relatively high level present on the SCBA before the exercise was even done, which might be more reflective of how this equipment is cleaned and disinfected after use. So something interesting to think about there. You might be, as a firefighter, exposed to this gear very, very frequently. Is it disinfected appropriately? Do you know? Just good questions to ask, in my opinion. Okay, but what was noted here was that by far the piece of equipment that was the most contaminated after use was the self-contained breathing apparatus. And again, this is on the surface of the SCBA, so just be mindful, I would say, after working with this equipment, of touching this stuff with your bare hands if it hasn't been fully disinfected. And I guess I didn't really talk too much about what these things were on the previous slide, but you can see that we had some familiar faces here. So they looked for naphthalene, they looked for benzoapyrene, etc. But all of these are just varying forms of sticking those cycles, those rings of carbon together, and they produce slightly different toxic effects as a result. Okay, so that's sort of all I wanted to say on the sort of occupational exposure. And if you're really interested in this study, I can link you the whole thing. It's quite long, and there was a lot more data collected. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, let me know, and I can send it along to you. But anyway, let's keep going along and talk about, so for 2 examples of PAHs, why are they toxic? What do they do in your body when they are exposed or they absorb When they are absorbed dermally through skin or inhaled into your lungs, what do they do and why are they bad? Okay? So before we answer this question, it's useful to talk about metabolism, because ultimately what your body does when you put stuff into it is it metabolizes it, or it consumes it. So think like a molecule of sugar. So let's say you were to eat a sugar cube, which has a bunch of sucrose really, but that's linked together glucose molecules. It's a dimer specifically, but let's just say you eat some sugar, which can be abbreviated as C6H12O6. So what your body does to that sugar is it uses the oxygen that is transported via your blood, via hemoglobin, to all of your cells, and those cells take that sugar molecule, react it with O2, in the presence of enzymes or proteins that do important cellular functions. So you run on enzymes essentially, and it converts it to CO2. Let's make sure this is balanced. Hopefully this is looking familiar. And it converts it to H2O, and it also produces energy in this process. So the exact same chemical reaction we used for wildfires applies to your body metabolizing things. So, and it's important to note that for a wildfire, this energy liberated is in the form of heat. For us, for metabolism, that energy is in the form of a specific molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is sort of used by our body to do various cellular functions like synthesizing new proteins or triggering your immune response to kill off pathogens that are detected in your bloodstream, etc. So metabolism is basically a wildfire, just in a more controlled way so that we get more useful forms of energy out, okay? We certainly produce some heat in the process of metabolism. That's why your breath, when you breathe it out, is hot. That's where our nascent body temperature sort of comes from, because we're constantly producing heat and energy. But regardless, all I'm trying to say is that a general way of thinking of metabolism is adding oxygens to stuff. Let's just say stuff. Let's be more specific, because you don't do this to calcium ions that you take in like drinking milk or something. So you're adding oxygen atoms to carbon specifically. That's generally how you can think of metabolism. You can think of a molecule of fat, so something like linoleic acid is like C18H36O2, something like this. I think this is linoleic acid. Here, since I'm not confident, let's do this. Let's just call it a molecule of fat. So this is a molecule of fat. If you were to eat this, well, a similar process happens. I'm not going to try to balance this one on the fly because there's a lot of carbons there. Okay, we can try. And then the oxygens would be 36, 72, 35, something like that. Regardless, same thing happens. You take in a molecule of fat, your body metabolizes it to form CO2. So it basically stuffs as many oxygens on every carbon atom as possible. And in doing so, again, produces more ATP, which is what we use to function or perform a lot of cellular functions. So where I'm going with all of this is that naphthalene and benzoapyrene are forms of carbon. So we have C10H8 and then C20H12. So these are forms of carbon. So they get oxidized through a slightly different pathway. So basically, if your body cannot utilize something to produce ATP, to flush it out of your body, that's why we have our liver, a similar process occurs. So these are not very water soluble, not very water soluble. So the first thing our body needs to do to these molecules, which aren't really useful in terms of producing ATP, our body still needs to get rid of them. And in doing so, or in attempting to doing so, our body still adds oxygens to it, to these, in your liver by specifically what is called the cytochrome C oxidase enzyme. So you don't need to know that, but that's just, in general what your body does. So it adds oxygen to these to make them water soluble. So in general, the more oxygens something has, it's going to be more water soluble. We don't need to know why, but just trust me on that, okay? So what our body does to these, C10H8 gets converted with this cytochrome C oxidase. I'll call it CytCO for cytochrome C oxidase, or OX. And the same is true for C20H12. Is they get converted, they get oxygens added to them. That way, when I didn't say why water solubility was important here, because ultimately these then will get flushed into our urine and excreted that way, okay? That's why making these water soluble is important for getting them out of our body. So in the process of making naphthalene and benzopyrene A, benzoapyrene water soluble, they get oxygens added to them, and they form a variety of metabolites, is what they would be called, but like something like this, C10H8O2, and benzoapyrene gets converted to, what is it here, C20H14, it gets 2 extra hydrogens. No, it gets 3 extra hydrogens. It's H15. H15O2 plus. So it gets converted into a cation. And really the same is true for this one. It really gets converted to a cation. So C10H, is it 3 hydrogens again? It might, yeah, I think it is. They have similar transformations that occur, where basically some water molecules get added to them. That's where those H's are coming from. And they get converted into these cations here. So these can bind to DNA. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. That's what that stands for. And it's sort of the genetic code that's in the nucleus of our cells that allows the cells to function. So just to quickly go over why DNA is important is because our bodies, our cells, take DNA in the nucleus, convert it through a process called transcription. So transcription converts it into RNA, and specifically it forms mRNA. So you may remember back when the COVID vaccine was coming out, there was all this discussion in the news about RNA vaccines. So specifically what that was is mRNA, messenger RNA, in this vaccine that codes for a little spike protein on the outside of the COVID particle. We don't need to get into how a vaccine works, but regardless, the RNA was the main component in there. And then this undergoes a process called translation that ultimately forms a protein. Or as I called them earlier in this lecture, an enzyme. So enzymes, like I said, is how we exist. An enzyme, there's an enzyme for doing pretty much any chemical reaction that your body does. So, metabolism, we use enzymes for that. Or converting things into a water-soluble form so that we can excrete them through urine. We have an enzyme for that. There's enzymes for literally every function of what your body does. Contracting a muscle, that's enzymes are responsible for doing that. But regardless, what these toxins do is they disrupt this transcription translation process. So ultimately, they affect the DNA portion of this. So they bind to DNA and they lead to errors in the DNA. So when the cell is replicated, those errors in DNA carry over, ultimately leading to that cell that is affected, leading to an error in the protein that is formed, okay? So I guess I'll put that in writing here. So the error, so I'll just pick the benzopyrene A example. C20H15O2 plus binds to DNA. This leads to an error in the DNA sequence, or rather in DNA replication. That leads to an error in DNA replication. And this ultimately leads to an error in the protein that is made. Okay, so let's look at what I mean when they bind to DNA. So this is, I guess we have a lot of chemical structure in this lecture today, but this is what we call a ball and stick model in chemistry. So in chemistry, we can think of elements and atoms as little spheres of different sizes. And we can think of them as they bond to other elements as having a little stick to represent that bond. So you can see here, there's like a little stick connecting that carbon and hydrogen molecule, or there's a little stick here connecting that phosphorus to an oxygen atom. But regardless, we can think of chemical structures in this way. Is it representative of how molecules bind in the real world? Well, no, there's no little sticks holding them together. They're electrostatically immobilized, or mostly immobilized, and there's no like physical thing between them other than electrons. But anyway, all I'm trying to say is that we can think of structure and think of chemical reactivity in terms of a ball and stick model. What we have here is, you may have heard of this, you may have seen this before, is the classic double helix, or the I keep saying the double helical structure of DNA, where it forms this really interesting, intricate structure that involves, it coiling around as it propagates, okay? And the heart of DNA, the part that encodes the genetic information that is so important, is right here in the middle of this double helix. So all along the middle of this is where the important genetic code is. And this involves certain classes of molecules called pyrimidines binding to what are called purines. So you can see some of letters here. So pyrimidines are our thymines and cytosines. It's just the type of molecule it is. And then here we have our adenine, and our guanine. So when I say that those harmful metabolites that are produced in the effort to make naphthalene and benzoapyrene water soluble so that we can excrete it out of our bodies, these cations bind to guanine specifically, okay? So they bind to guanine and they introduce a disruption in the structure of DNA. So then when our cells are, so I guess I'll put this here in writing, so they bind to guanine. So when our cells are replicating this particular DNA strand with this, naphthalene or benzoapyrene or just any polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon metabolite bonded to it, it's going to read that as an error, or like it'll skip over that this GC pair, and in doing so introduces an error in the sequence of DNA. And it may seem really inconsequential, like who cares if you skip over one little bit of the DNA, but in some cases that can lead to really drastic defects in the protein that is ultimately made from this DNA strand, and decrease the efficacy with which our cells can function. Ultimately, what this leads to, through a slew of mechanisms that we don't have to get into, just know that for our class, just know that polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in general bind to DNA, disrupt its structure, and ultimately leads to errors in the DNA sequence, which can propagate down our cellular and metabolic chain and lead to cancer formation, or rapid cell growth that leads to tumors and stuff. Okay, which I realize this is a really big jump here. We are skipping over a lot of complicated biochemistry here simply because we don't have the time to focus in on it. Just trust me that these errors in genetic sequences often lead to cancer formation in some capacity, okay? And that is why when I had on this previous slide here, why were these researchers looking at these 12 PAHs specifically? Because these are known as carcinogens, okay? Because they all have similar reactivity where they are metabolized to some extent and bind to DNA and ultimately disrupts these genetic cellular processes leading to cancer, okay? So that's sort of the big reason why polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are so dangerous, is because, significant exposure to them can lead to cancer in people who are exposed to them, okay? So that was PAHs. So now let's get to our last topic of the video, which is talking about specifically organic carbon particulate matter toxicity. And of particular interest for our lecture is going to be acrolein. So acrolein is a type of organic carbon, C3H8O. No, not 8. That's way too many hydrogens. C3H4. There we go. O. And this has really interesting toxicity or toxic effects, different than PAHs, so it doesn't really interact with DNA as much. But really, the sort of end result of this is it can lead to significant cardiovascular disease, which is kind of a big umbrella term for a lot of things. We'll talk about specifically what cardiovascular effects can happen due to acrolein exposure. And before we get into that, I just realized in that little pause I took there that I made a really big mistake really early on that propagated down. Oh, that's so embarrassing. Naphthalene is C8H10. Ugh, so I'm so sorry for this. So it's going to change a lot of this. I mean, the idea, the chemistry that happens is the same. So none of that is incorrect. It's just this formula should be different throughout all of this process. And so it actually, what it forms here is it's a little different than benzoapyrene, where instead it forms C8H8O2. It actually loses hydrogen. So it's a little bit different chemical mechanism here. But so it forms C8H8O2, not C10H13O2, slightly different. But the end result is the same. Okay, so hopefully I didn't completely lose you with this quick correction here. Slightly different formula, all of the causality, all of the toxicity, exactly the same. Okay, so anyway, let's continue on to acrolein, where acrolein can particularly affect cardiac cells or endothelial tissue, basically tissue related to your heart. So specifically, for reasons that, again, we just don't have time to get into, this is particularly effective towards what are called myocytes. And these are specific, let's say, heart cells that are responsible for contraction of the heart. So think of your heart beating, it's contracting. The cells that are responsible for that are called myocytes, okay? And what acrolein does in myocytes is it's particularly effective at binding, so it binds to proteins. So again, these are things that are important for helping our cells to function. It binds to proteins specifically in the mitochondria, of the myocytes. So this is one thing it can do. So remember, mitochondria, you may remember this from like high school biology or something, but this is the region of the cell where that ATP formation occurs. So the mitochondria is where the region of the cell where this reaction, this chemical reaction we wrote on this slide here, that's where this whole process occurs. This is in the mitochondria, so it's a specific region of the cell where all of this happens. So when I say that acrolein binds to proteins in the mitochondria, I'm referring to these proteins here. And additionally, what it can do, so this is one effect. So you can imagine if our myocytes aren't able to generate ATP efficiently, that's going to impact the function that myocytes have, which is contracting the heart. So hopefully you're able to follow that. And then one other thing it can do is that acrolein, so C3H4O, can also, we'll say, deactivate what are called it can deactivate what are called nitric oxide synthase enzymes, and these are often abbreviated as NOS in biochemistry. And the reason this is harmful is because our body uses nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, this molecule, is just NO. So I'm not shouting at you in all caps writing no. This is nitric oxide. It is one atom of nitrogen bonded to one atom of oxygen. And specifically what this is good at doing is it removes, our bodies naturally produce it because it removes what are called reactive oxygen species. Or ROS. Okay, so these reactive oxygen species are sort of naturally occurring, naturally forming harmful things in our body that our body luckily has evolved and come up with ways to remove these things. So when I say reactive oxygen species, I'm talking like what's called superoxide. So it's got a negative charge here, and it's a radical, so I give it that dot to denote that it has a single unpaired electron, which remember we talked about in our atmospheric chemistry lectures related to the stratosphere, that radicals are very reactive. So I'm talking like superoxide, which is what this is called, superoxide, or sometimes you can form hydrogen peroxide, so another very oxidizing chemical. And you can also form hydroxyl radical. So another one from our, I guess it wasn't the stratosphere, there was the troposphere lecture where we talked about radicals. But regardless, our body can form these things and they can harm cell protein function. They can harm the sort of structural integrity of a cell, causing it to like collapse on itself. They can do a lot of negative things. So the fact that acrolein, C3H4O, is able to deactivate these nitric oxide synthase molecules and proteins is it diminishes our body's ability to protect itself against reactive oxygen species. Yeah, so, and remember, this is specific to the myocytes. So this impact is in the myocyte, in the heart cell responsible for contraction. So it does sort of two things. It can bind to proteins in the mitochondria, negatively impacting ATP formation, and it also can disrupt this natural formation of nitric oxide, which helps to remove reactive oxygen species and lower what is called the oxidative stress on the cell. Okay, so the end result of both of these things, the end result here is that acrolein can lead to, so can cause what is called cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy, which is basically a fancy medical term for saying your heart cannot beat on a consistent rhythm or basis like it usually does, okay? Yeah, so this is like the end result of acrolein, which again is just one type of organic carbon that is going to be present in air. But in general, other forms of organic carbon will have similar toxic effects. It's just acrolein is picked as sort of like a molecule that is representative of the toxic effects of organic carbon. Okay, so just like with the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, I want to give some sort of good news with this. Like, what can you do to prevent the adverse health effects? And this is specifically of acrolein. So we talked about in PAHs. That's why I wanted to include that occupational exposure stuff. So at least you are more well equipped to protect yourself in the future that you will likely have in the field of firefighting. So what about with acrolein and these sorts of organic carbons? What can you do? So remember, one of the things that acrolein was bad for was it increased the amount of reactive oxygen species in your body. So this was things like O2 minus, this was things like H2O2, and it was things like the hydroxyl radical. Okay, so there is some research to suggest that the ingestion of foods high in antioxidants is a good way to remove these reactive oxygen species. So one possible thing to do is consume foods high in antioxidants for them to take care of these reactive oxygen species where, acrolein will remove your myocytes' natural ability to remove these ROSs. A possible preventative measure, and I just want to say possible because there is very preliminary and uncertain research in this area. So it is proposed that consuming foods with antioxidants could have an effect, a positive effect on removing reactive oxygen species. Oh, and I guess I just want to make it clear I am not a doctor, a medical doctor. I'm not the good kind of doctor, I guess. and I'm not giving you stringent medical advice here. I'm just simply trying to present to you some interesting science that you could use, or rather you could research further on your own, okay? But anyway, so antioxidants, so think things like blueberries or like vegetables and fruits tend to be high in antioxidants. What these do is they contain what are called flavonoids. Flavonoids. So these are types of molecules that are able to react with reactive oxygen species and remove them, thus preventing any harmful effects they would have on your cells, okay? And there are several different kinds of flavonoids. I think like 20 or more that can be. There are like 20 or more molecules that can be classified as flavonoids. So an example of one is quercetin. Quercetin, and this has the chemical formula of C15H something O7. How many H's was it? No, it was H10O7. And what this can do is it can react. Let's pick, superoxide as an example. It can react with things like superoxide to ultimately form. Basically, what happens is it forms CO2. That's sort of like the byproduct of this reaction. So just subtract CO2 from this over here, and we would have C. It loses a hydrogen as well, but that's unimportant. It forms C14H9O7 as a result. But regardless, it is able to remove this harmful reactive oxygen species through this sort of general reaction here. So the theory with this sort of antioxidant research in terms of like how it affects your metabolism is that ingesting things like blueberries, fruits and vegetables and that sort of stuff, things high in antioxidants, can potentially benefit you should you be more exposed to reactive oxygen species, and that it would be exactly the case if you were exposed to higher levels of acrolein. That would prevent your myocytes' ability to produce nitric oxides. No nitric oxides mean you have more reactive oxygen species, and this can lead to cardiovascular disease. So possibly some intervention could be done on your own part through the ingestion of foods higher in antioxidants. Okay, so hopefully this was a little bit interesting chemistry for you today. It's definitely a different change of pace with all the focus on biochemistry. Hopefully I didn't lose you with too much jargon or anything. And yeah, so in our next lecture, what we'll do is we'll focus on wildfire suppression. And then in our very last lecture, we'll talk about sort of emerging strategies that might become more prevalent for preventing wildfires in the first place. Okay, so that's all from me for now. I'll see you in the next video.